Back in 1999, the global music industry was absolutely just printing money. They were selling these kind of little plastic CDs for £15 a go, and they seemed totally invincible. I mean, they were dominating global culture, no question. And then, 3 years later, they were fighting for that absolute survival against this tiny, simple line of computer code called the MP3. It was a complete bloodbath. And it shows that strategy isn't just some abstract buzzword that's reserved for CEOs sitting in glass boardrooms somewhere. It's it's more like it's the invisible physics of survival. It's the underlying gravity that governs basically every product you buy, every company you work for, and every market you might want to invest in. Welcome back to the Strategy Show, the podcast that connects real-world business events with the strategy concepts that help us understand them. I'm Ben Dixon Green, and today we'll be looking at how businesses actually survive in the wild, or I guess more often why they completely fail. Please drop me a follow and feel free to drop a comment to let me know your thoughts on our video. Now, in this episode, we're going to map out the classic rules of the game. We'll look at how to actually define an industry. We're going to look at the legendary five forces model that dictates who holds the power. And then we're going to have a look at the life cycle that tracks an industry from birth to death. But the really fascinating part of this session, I think, isn't just learning those rules, it's figuring out exactly where these kind of old school, rigid academic models get into difficulties when they try and deal with our modern kind of hyper-connected digital world. And on the back of that, how far we can actually trust using them nowadays. Because you really can't just blindly trust a model that was built back in 1979 to navigate a tech startup today. You have to understand the model's blind spots. But before we even get to analysing competitive pressures, we have to establish the absolute basics. Where does our business's battlefield actually begin and end? Because that seems like it should be totally obvious. If I sell coffee, surely my battlefield is the coffee market. Now, this is the exact trap that many strategic analyses fall into right on day one. People use market and industry interchangeably all the time. But strategically, they are two totally different concepts. A market is made up of the customers, it's the demand side. So that's the people that have a specific need that they want satisfied. So the market is like me needing a huge caffeine hit at 7 in the morning. An industry is made up of the businesses, it's the supply side. So it's the group of organizations that have similar competencies and technologies, and they use them to satisfy that kind of morning caffeine need. Now, what can confuse us even more is when people start talking about sectors and industries. Now, I want to get to grips with this, and we'll do it by using the example of aviation. Because let's say I'm trying to analyse my competition as a business, and I say, well, I'm in the aviation sector. Now, be careful when you use the term sector. Sector is massively broad. It includes everything to do with aviation, like, the companies manufacturing the actual airplanes, like Boeing. It includes the catering companies making those tiny foil-wrapped airplane meals, like LSG Sky Chefs. Anything at all to do with aviation. But obviously, Boeing and the catering company aren't fighting each other. They might operate in the same broad sector, certainly. But if the global price of aluminium skyrockets, Boeing is going to be in an absolute state of panic, while the catering company is barely going to even notice. An industry is a much tighter and I suppose more ruthless classification. The airline industry is a specific subset of companies that have highly substitutable services. So we're talking Ryanair, British Airways, Qantas, Virgin, because those companies are locked in direct combat. I mean, if the price of jet fuel spikes, British Airways and Ryanair are both going to feel that exact same pain on the exact same day. I suppose in sports vernacular, they're on the same pitch. And actually, sports is quite a good analogy here. If you step onto a sports field, you have to know the rules of the game that you're playing. If you walk onto a football pitch and pick up the ball with your hands, then you're going to lose. So if you define your industry incorrectly from the start, you're going to end up analyzing the wrong threats, you're going to prepare for the wrong pressures, and basically you're going to be fighting a company that isn't even playing your sport. So getting it right is incredibly important. Now that brings us to the ultimate tool for measuring those pressures. Once you know exactly who's on the pitch with you, how do you actually measure the forces that are trying to push you out of business? And for that, organizations tend to start by using the absolute heavyweight champion of strategic frameworks, which was created by Michael Porter at Harvard back in 1979. And it is Porter's 5 forces. Now, if you have spent more than 10 minutes in a business school, you have heard of this thing. The core idea is that the long-term profitability of any industry is dictated by 5 specific structural pressures: the threat of new entrants, the power of buyers, power of suppliers, the threat of substitutes, and competitive rivalry. Now, let's look at these 5 carefully, because some of them can sometimes feel a little bit counterintuitive to some people. Now, let's start off with the power of customers, which Porter lists as a competitive threat. Now, people sometimes wonder why we look at our customers as being a threat. I mean, you spend half your budget on marketing to make customers love your brand. Why am I suddenly treating them like the enemy? Well, remember, Porter isn't measuring brand love or customer satisfaction here. He's entirely focused on leverage and profitability, so it is strictly about money. The bargaining power of buyers is about how much power your customers have to squeeze your profit margins. Think about a company that manufactures, I don't know, a really generic car part like a standard windshield wiper motor. If your only major buyer for that product is Ford, then Ford has immense power because you literally have no one else to sell to. They can walk into the negotiation room and say, right, cut your price by 10%, or we're going to take our billion-dollar contract to your competitor down the street. And you have pretty much no choice but to absorb that loss. Well, they might not demand a price cut, but they might demand that we invest millions in a new quality testing facility just to keep their business. Either way, the buyer is using their power to directly extract profit out of your pocket. Now, obviously, that makes sense for kind of business to business where you have these massive contracts. But what about everyday consumers? So, like if I'm selling smartphones, a random guy that buys a phone in an electric store doesn't have any bargaining power at all. Now, it's true, that individual doesn't, but the collective buyer base absolutely does, especially if switching costs are low. So in other words, if it costs a consumer basically nothing to switch from your product to a competitor's product, that gives them a degree of power. So, if it costs a consumer nothing to switch from your app to a competitor's app, the collective power of buyers forces you to keep your app free or at least incredibly cheap. And that naturally caps your industry's overall profitability. So you've got buyers kind of squeezing you from one side. What about the other side of the supply chain? Because Porter also lists the power of suppliers as being another major threat. Now, to be honest, this is the exact same dynamic, just in reverse. Think about an airline, say Ryanair. How many companies can actually sell you a massive commercial jet? Basically 2. You have Boeing and you have Airbus, which means that those 2 suppliers have got a terrifying amount of power. If Boeing decides to just, raise the price for 737, Ryanair can't just go buy a plane from some local startup. They have to pay the premium. So high supplier power means that the supplier can just capture all the value for themselves, leaving the airline industry with those famously razor-thin margins. So as a business, you're kind of trapped between suppliers charging you more and buyers refusing to pay you more, which then naturally leads to the third force, which is the threat of new entrants. Because if your industry is somehow still making really good money despite those squeezes, then new players are going to see that and want a piece of the pie. So how do you keep these new entrants out? The answer is, as a business, you build a fortress. Strategically, we call these barriers to entry. And we're going to use a really kind of mundane example to illustrate this. Paint manufacturing. Specifically, massive legacy domestic brands like Dulux and Crown in the UK. Now, paint seems like it should be so easy to replicate. It's just mixed up chemicals in a tin can. So why isn't every aspiring entrepreneur launching a disruptive paint company from their garage? Well, the reason is because of the maths of economies of scale, which is just brutal for a startup. Imagine you actually want to compete with Dulux. The first thing you have to do is build a chemical manufacturing plant, and that isn't cheap. Let's say it costs £50 million. If you only manage to produce and sell 1,000 cans of paint in your first year, the fixed factory costs embedded in each of those individual paint cans is astronomical. You'd have to sell them for like thousands of pounds a can just to break even. Meanwhile, Dulux is pumping out tens of millions of gallons a year. Their massive volume spreads that initial £50 million factory cost so incredibly thin that their cost per gallon is practically zero. So a startup physically can't price their product low enough to even compete on day one with those big players. And then you add in the kind of deeply entrenched brand trust. I mean, people don't want to risk their living room walls peeling in 6 months just to try an unknown brand. Then there's the lockdown retail distribution. So, getting shelf space in a major hardware store right next to Dulux is nearly impossible for a newcomer. So there are all these massive barriers to entry that make the industry really unattractive to startups, and it means the threat of new entrants is kept artificially low. Now, this brings us to a really tricky force, I think anyway, which is the threat of substitutes. Because if I'm running an airline, my direct competitors are just other airlines. But I also need to think about substitutes, threats coming from totally different industries. If you want the technical definition, a substitute is a product or service from an entirely different industry, but that satisfies the exact same underlying customer need. And the real danger of a substitute is that it acts as a kind of hard, invisible ceiling on your prices. Let's stick with travel and airlines for a minute and consider the Eurostar. The Eurostar is the Channel Tunnel train link between London and Paris that runs under the English Channel. The airline industry and the railway industry use completely different technology, totally different competencies, totally different business models. But if you're flying from London to Paris and the airlines decide to suddenly charge, I don't know, £2,000 for an economy seat, well, the customer's going to say, forget it, I'm going to take the train. The existence of the train, that substitute, dictates the absolute maximum price the airline can get away with charging. Now, we can actually see this playing out rather brutally in the digital space right now too. Think about streaming platforms. Why are major streaming television platforms suddenly pouring all this money into interactive features or offering free mobile games inside their apps? Well, it's because they aren't just fighting other television streaming services. They're fighting the threat of a massive substitute, which is social media and video games. A teenager deciding to spend 3 hours playing a game on their phone is satisfying the exact same need for entertainment as watching a movie. So video games place a cap on how much a streaming service can reasonably charge before the user just switches mediums entirely. Okay, so we have the power of buyers, power of sub-suppliers, the threat of new entrants, and the threat of substitutes. That leaves us with the fifth and final force, which is competitive rivalry. Basically, the bloodbath between the companies already inside the industry. But actually, rivalry isn't always seen as just being a separate fifth pillar that stands next to the other four. It's a bit different. Arguably, it's the direct result of the other four. You can think of the industry as a pressure cooker. Rivalry isn't an independent ingredient, it's the thermometer that reads the heat. So, if your suppliers are raising costs and your buyers are demanding lower prices and substitutes are threatening to steal your audience, the overall profit pool of the industry shrinks. And as the walls close in, the firms trapped inside start competing much more aggressively, slashing prices, trying to steal each other's customers just to survive. So, in that way, that kind of last fifth force becomes kind of a result of the other four. And that's our five forces. Now, Porter's model is so elegant. It maps out perfectly the structural forces that squeeze a business. But, and it's a big but, it was published in 1979. This is a very long time ago in business years. So, what we need to do is look at some of the modern critiques on Porter's model. Because ultimately, how does a model built before the internet actually hold up in a world of constant digital disruption? Honestly, it struggles. I think the most glaring limitation is that Porter's model is very much just like a static snapshot. It's like navigating a cross country road trip using a printed paper map from 1995 while everyone else is using a live GPS with traffic updates. The paper map is technically accurate. It shows you where the major highways are, but it's completely blind to the sudden, 10-car pileup 3 miles ahead, or the new road that they opened yesterday. Now, in highly stable industries like, say, steel manufacturing, that paper map works fine. The industry doesn't change much, the roads don't change much. But in dynamic, tech heavy fields, the landscape that you operate in changes hourly. By the time a corporate board finishes a really rigid 6-month five forces analysis, there's a new technology that's completely rewritten the rules of their industry, and it makes the whole report totally obsolete. And not to mention, Porter's five forces also assumes this kind of mindset of total constant warfare. It assumes that you're always fighting your suppliers, fighting your buyers, fighting your competitors. But modern business actually doesn't look like that at all. Some economists argue that Porter completely missed a massive, kind of crucial dynamic here, the concept of complementers as a sixth force. Now, what do we mean by a complementer? A complementer is an entirely separate entity whose product makes your product significantly more valuable. So, like app developers for smartphones. Apple doesn't view an independent game studio as a threat or a supplier or a buyer. They want them to thrive. Because, a brilliantly designed game makes the iPhone infinitely more attractive to a consumer. Social media influencers are in the same position for social media companies. They're not really suppliers or customers. But if those influencers are supported to create interesting content, then it kind of draws in users to the social media network and makes the network more valuable. So Porter's kind of combat heavy framework doesn't have an elegant way of measuring how this collaboration actually creates value. Now, linked to that is one of the other problems with Porter's five forces, which is what's sometimes called the myth of the lone wolf. Porter kind of assumes that no alliances exist. But nowadays, modern global supply chains are literally built on these kind of deep partnerships between companies. You might collaborate really closely with a supplier to develop a new material that actually lowers costs for both of you. And that completely bypasses this kind of adversarial dynamic that Porter assumes is inevitable in your industry. Finally, there's a massive kind of cultural bias baked into Porter's five forces. Porter builds his entire theory on a very specific Western assumption, which is that the ultimate kind of unyielding goal of any corporation is to maximize short-term shareholder wealth, so kind of profit above all else, which on a global scale is historically inaccurate. I mean, we could discuss the historical significance of corporate giants in Japan and South Korea, the Keiretsu and Shibol systems. These kind of massive groups of companies had access to very low cost capital that was usually backed by kind of state aligned banks. So their primary objective wasn't extracting maximum quarterly profit. Their goal was long term, overwhelming market share. They'd happily operate on razor thin margins or actually even take losses for years just to dominate a particular market. And if your competitor doesn't care about short-term profit, a framework like Five Forces that's based entirely on profit pressures is completely useless for predicting their next move. And there's one other stakeholder that Porter doesn't really take account of, which is the government. Porter treats the government like this kind of passive referee that's just standing on the sidelines, blowing the whistle occasionally when something goes wrong. In reality, massive regulatory shifts, state subsidies, or, like antitrust lawsuits can wipe out an industry overnight, completely independent of buyer or supplier power, but it's not there within the Five Forces model. So Porter is good. Porter's model is a good one, but it still gives us this kind of flawed, static snapshot of pressures. So what we really need is a different framework to try and map the dimension of time. We need a model that acts more like, I suppose, a video recording, showing how these pressures evolve over the lifespan of an industry. And that's where we transition to the industry life cycle, which is another key model that helps you understand how to manage your place in your industry. Now, this model argues that all industries follow the same classic journey through four main stages: introduction, growth, maturity, and decline. But many newer approaches to this insert a new kind of brutal stage between growth and maturity. They call it the shakeout, and it's literally the graveyard of startup companies, and it's fascinating. So we're going to talk about that a bit. During the introduction stage, early adopters are buying, a novel new technology. In the growth phase, the market catches on, sales explode, and you get a swarm of competitors flooding into the industry because they smell easy money. But you can't have exponential growth forever. Eventually, the market begins to saturate, demand slows down. Now, let's actually walk through the financial mechanics of why that slowdown is so deadly. Because it's not just annoying, it can be fatal. If I'm a tech startup in the growth phase, I've probably taken on massive amounts of venture capital debt to scale my operations, build huge servers, hire hundreds of developers. And I did all this assuming that my sales will just keep doubling every year so I can afford to pay it all. But then the growth curve flattens. You still have the massive debt, you still have the bloated payroll, but the easy new customers are just gone. So to pay my bills, I desperately need cash flow. So what do? I slash my prices to try and steal customers from my competitors. The problem is, the competitors panic and slash their prices too. And suddenly the entire industry is locked in this brutal price war. Margins evaporate. And what that means is the companies with weaker balance sheets or slightly inferior products simply run out of cash and go bankrupt, or they're bought up for pennies by the larger firms. The industry violently kind of shakes out the weak players. So only the strongest players survive to enter the maturity phase, where sales volume is stable, it's a mass market, and you basically only grow by slowly eroding the market share of the guy next to you. Until finally, customer preferences change, new technology arrives, and the industry enters decline and dies. But is that death inevitable? Like, do all industries just always follow this curve right to the grave? Well, there are some examples that argue against decline being fatal, such as the music industry. Certain physical product industries, like the steel industry, or I don't know, manufacturing of top hats, they followed a very traditional, predictable life cycle curve into maturity or decline. But the music industry has survived for over a century by fundamentally understanding what it was they were selling. They realized very early on that their core product wasn't the physical plastic, it wasn't the vinyl or the CD, it was the intellectual property, it was the art. They took the exact same core product, the IP, the intellectual property, and constantly restarted their own product lifecycle using new formats. So, in the 1900s, sheet music declined, so they triggered a new introduction phase with vinyl. Vinyl matured, so they moved into cassettes, then CDs, then MP3s, then digital downloads, now global streaming. They survived not by trying to fight the life cycle, but by kind of endlessly looping back to the beginning of it with new technology. But I mean, even with that clever loop, we have to look at some of the rather harsh critiques of the life cycle model itself. Now, the life cycle is kind of a universally taught concept, but some modern strategists kind of question its validity as a predictive tool because the model kind of implies a guaranteed destiny. It implies that every single product will naturally progress through these neat, orderly phases. But the actual reality of the market is really just chaos. Some products exhibit no normal patterns whatsoever. A product might be introduced with massive hype and then instantly die before it ever reaches a growth phase. Other products might linger in this kind of bizarre state of permanent introduction. So the problem you have with the life cycle is that it really is just a post-mortem tool. It's very easy to look backward at the history of the VHS tape and draw a kind of perfect bell curve showing its rise and fall. But it's incredibly difficult to look at, say, an emerging AI technology today and accurately plot whether it's in early growth, late growth, or about to hit a massive shakeout. Which brings all of this to the core takeaway for anyone trying to navigate a business landscape today. Whether you're deciding to launch a new feature at your company, maybe you're considering a career change into a new sector, or you're analyzing an investment, you're constantly trying to assess risk. The sharpest critique of models like Porter's five forces and the kind of rigid life cycle is that they force you into a purely outside-in perspective. What that means is that you spend all your time looking out the window. You obsess over external threats, the bargaining power of your suppliers, the threat of your substitutes, and where the broader market curve is heading. And in doing so, you risk completely ignoring your own internal resource-based strengths. You might spend 6 months terrified of an external competitor, but fail to realize that your own internal team possess some kind of highly unique, deeply specialized competencies that would allow you to bypass that competitor completely. What we're saying is you can't just spend all your time staring out the window at the enemy. You have to look in the mirror at what you actually possess. So we've covered an incredible amount of ground today. We've established how to correctly draw the borders of an industry to ensure you're analysing the right game. We mapped the very intense structural pressures that kind of are squeezing that industry using the five forces, looking at the maths of economies of scale and leveraging suppliers. And we tracked how industries age through the life cycle, exposing the financial realities of the shakeout phase. And most importantly, I think we kind of tore into the limitations of these academic models. We highlighted how they struggle to account for digital speed, strategic alliances, and kind of the reality nowadays of complementary technologies. Because the main thing I want to stress here is that these strategic frameworks are invaluable lenses, but they are not absolute laws of physics. They are starting points for critical thinking. Which is why I want to leave you with one final unexplored thought to carry with you. We talked a lot about the industry life cycle, and we said that the model kind of fundamentally frames decline as this sad, inevitable end of the line. It's the phase where your industry just fades away, goes bankrupt, or is just quietly absorbed. But consider this. What if decline isn't a graveyard? What if the collapse of one kind of massive, rigid industry is actually the ultimate fertilizer? Think about the sheer volume of highly trained talent, that the billions in capital, and the kind of pent up customer frustration that gets released into the wild when a giant industry begins to crumble. What if that exact moment of decline is the precise trigger that then instantly sparks the introduction phase of a radically different, entirely new, exciting industry? The destruction of an old industry isn't a failure. It's the exact fuel that's needed for a new industry. And I think that perhaps changes how you look at a dying market entirely. Strategy, as we said at the beginning, is the invisible physics governing the business world. The better you understand the gravity, the friction, and the forces at play, and crucially, I think where those rules break down in reality, the better you can navigate your own path through the chaos. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Strategy Show. If you've enjoyed it or you found it useful, please follow the podcast so you won't miss future episodes. And feel free to drop a comment on the episode as well. See you next time.